Welcome to the presentation. My name is Dermot Moloney. I originally qualified in environmental health in 1986 and I subsequently undertook an MSc in environmental protection. I then studied for the IOA, the Institute of Acoustics diploma, and subsequently completed a Master's in Applied Acoustics while working in consultancy. And more recently, I completed an MSc in Occupational Hygiene. Okay, some of my professional accreditations and certifications are as follows. I'm a chartered scientist. I'm a certified person in noise and vibration. I'm certified in the measurement of hazardous substances. I'm a member of the Institute of Acoustics, that's the IOA, and I'm a member of the Faculty of Occupational Hygiene, and that's at the British Occupational Hygiene Society. Initially, I worked in OLIS, the Irish Science and Technology Agency, as part of their Atmospheric Environment Department. I subsequently was the manager of a university-based consultancy that was at University College Cork. And since 2005, I've been a guest lecturer and examiner at University College Dublin, UCD. I act as a senior tutor on acoustics and occupational hygiene training courses, and I also have been providing expert witness services in occupational hygiene and acoustics since 1992. In this presentation, I'm going to speak about noise-induced hearing loss, so NIHL, and workplace noise exposure. I'll initially speak on the technical and background details. I'll then consider some of the legal and practical issues. I'll address the assessment and survey priorities, and I'll pay some attention to the potential pitfalls that arise in the assessment process particularly. So noise-induced hearing loss, NIHL, it's regarded as the most common occupational disease, and that's according to the World Health Organization, WHO. And similarly, NIHL, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, regarded as the most prevalent irreversible occupational hazard. In practice, noise-induced hearing loss can be caused by sound pressure levels above 75 dBA. Most cases of NIHL will arise over many years and even more typically decades. So typically exposures above 75 or even 80 for decades will cause very, very slowly some individuals to suffer NIHL. The exception would be the situations where very rapid NIHL can arise, and we call these instances acoustic trauma or instantaneous hearing loss. And these happen in some situations where industries and our activities can give rise to extremely high peak noise levels. So in excess of 150 C-weighted decibels, or dBc, or higher, can cause instantaneous hearing loss with minimal exposure time. Occupational noise is ubiquitous. It occurs in virtually every industry. Obviously, some are of greater risk than others. In the USA, $242 million was paid out on compensation for noise-induced hearing loss in 2013. And in the UK, the annual costs of claims were running at £70 million per annum. Some of the identified factors which gave rise to an increase in claims in the UK included the financial recession, the influence of claims management companies, and claimant solicitor activity. So if we look at some of the technical details around about exposures and surveying, the daily noise exposure level, the LEX 8 hours, is the average noise energy a person is exposed to during a working day. LEX 8 hours is important as it can be used to estimate the likelihood of hearing loss. And it's also particularly important because LEX 8 hours forms the basis of assessing risk and establishing controls. LEX 8 hours is determined using the following formula. LEX 8 hours equals LEQ plus 10 times the log of T divided by 8. In this formula, LAEQ is the equivalent continuous level, also known as the time average level, and T, capital T, is the time in hours a person is likely to be exposed to the noise level per day. And again, we can simply compute the LEX 8 hours using a calculator or a spreadsheet using the above formula. Peak sound pressure level, Ppeak, is the maximum value of the C frequency weighted instantaneous sound pressure level. Ppeak is measured directly by a sound level meter. An instantaneous loss can be caused by an excessive Ppeak. So again, I mentioned typically above 150 dBc can cause instantaneous hearing loss. The General Application Regulations 2007 provide action and limit values at which the employer and the employee is compelled to take certain actions to minimize the risk of noise-induced hearing loss. So the lower exposure action value has a Ppeak of 135 dBc, and the LEX 8 hours at that level is 80 dBA. The exposure limit value, we have a 140 dBc Ppeak and an 87 dBA LEX 8 hours. Again, it's worthwhile to note that the exposure limit values take account of the protection which is afforded by hearing protectors, i.e. defenders or earmuffs or earplugs. So if you look at some of the requirements of the General Application Regulations regarding assessments and surveys, Regulation 124 requires the employer to make a suitable and appropriate assessment of the risk arising from noise exposure. It's interesting that the regulations state that the employer shall, if necessary, measure levels of noise. Again, we can use common sense here. We don't need to measure noise levels where it's very obvious that the noise is unlikely to exceed 75 dBA. A good case might be an office environment. In practice, while we can avoid taking measurements, it can be difficult to justify not taking measurements in an industrial environment like a factory where we really want to get an accurate measurement of the exposure levels. To achieve this, assessments must be planned and carried out competently. The survey or the assessment needs to be representative of the LEX 8 hours. And to that regard, we need to give particular attention to the noise level. We also need to consider the type and duration of exposure, and also the exposure to impulsive noise. So by impulsive, we mean noises that change very rapidly by a substantial margin of 10 decibels or in excess of 10 decibels. So something like a hammering or a pulsating noise would be classified as potentially impulsive. The methods and the measurements that we take need to be adapted to the prevailing conditions. So we tailor our measurements really in accordance with the operations and the likely equipment and the layout of a particular working environment. In addition, the assessments and surveys need to be carried out at suitable intervals. We use A-weighted decibels, dBA, to assess risk. And in virtually every situation, the noise won't be steady or continuous. It'll fluctuate even slightly, although we mightn't even be aware of those fluctuations. So the equivalent continuous level, the LEQ value, is really key to the survey. Again, this would be defined simply as a time average value. The dose is the dose which an individual acquires at work is due to the noise intensity and the duration of his or her exposure. And we measure dose using LEX 8 hours. That's the daily personal noise exposure. Also, peak noise level is particularly important. And again, this is the C-weighted dBc value, which we need to quantify in order to eliminate the possibility that instantaneous hearing loss is a risk factor. Typically, we will use either a sound level meter or a dosimeter, sometimes called a dose meter, to undertake our survey. Ideally, the instruments should be class 1. They need to fulfill the criteria and the requirements of certain standards. This involves them being calibrated and verified periodically by an independent laboratory. And again, before and after each set of measurements, we need to calibrate the instrument ourselves. Typically, this would involve a field calibration. We need to measure close to the worker's ear, typically within about 15 centimeters. And we should use spatial averaging or worst case values in order to determine the risk. So again, it's worthwhile to consider briefly the purpose of noise risk assessment. A good assessment should really facilitate an informed decision on the action required to prevent and/or control exposure. Some of the questions that we should answer would include: is there a noise exposure issue? And if so, what is causing it? What employees, if any, are at risk? Are there immediate steps required? What are they? Which and where? So what type of controls do we need? And how should we prioritize these controls? If we consider some of the assessment and survey priorities, a risk assessment RA must be representative of the LEX 8 hours, and we need to consider if action values or limit values are exceeded. Critical data in the assessment will include the LEQ, that's the equivalent continuous level, the LEX 8 hours, that's the daily personal exposure, and the Ppeak values. We should also identify how data was sourced and how our calculations were made. And again, we need to consider the exposed workers and identify where they are, referring to the exposure limit values. Looking at risk assessment, we need to consider both direct effects and indirect effects. We should also consider interactions. So in some instances, the workplace noise might be so excessive that employees may not be able to hear reversing alarms on forklift trucks, for example. Or in other instances, the exposure of a chemical agent, for example, toluene, might give rise to more noise-induced hearing loss than would otherwise be the case. So some chemicals combine with noise exposure to create a greater hearing loss. We call these ototoxic agents. One of the other issues we need to consider would be the availability of alternative equipment. So is the employer using equipment that is extremely old or damaged or particularly noisy relative to what is available on the market? Again, we need to consider issues like exposure beyond normal working time. Is there potential for employees to work overtime? And we should also consider health surveillance. In this context, health surveillance means audiometric testing or periodic hearing checks to detect the early signs of hearing loss. Again, we should review published data periodically. We shouldn't bury our heads in the sand when it comes to noise risk assessment. We are obligated under the General Application Regs to record the findings of our noise risk assessment in a safety statement. And we are also obligated to review the risk assessment as required. For example, if there's any reason to suspect that the assessment is no longer valid, we would then need to review and update as required. And a case or a suspected case of noise-induced hearing loss should trigger an immediate review. If this doesn't arise, routinely we should be reviewing the risk assessment at least every 2 years. The key outcomes. It's essential that we report the critical data, and these will include the LEEQ, the equivalent continuous level, the LEX 8 hours, the personal exposure levels, and the Ppeak values. We also need to determine if the lower exposure action value, the upper exposure action value, and or the ELV, the exposure limit value, are exceeded. We also need to address and identify the worker's exposure relative to these action values and limit values. And we also need to make informed decisions on the action required to protect them. So in effect, we need to identify the action plan and where it is appropriate. Some of the key outcomes of a good report and a good survey. Firstly, they're very useful to explain risk and can be used in training. And then in some instances, they can provide an effective means of defending claims. So claims for NIHL can be defended if our assessments are reliable and comprehensive. To this end, it's particularly important that the assessor is competent. So good assessment will provide a blueprint for action, or in some cases a justification for inaction. They're not merely designed for data gathering, and that is unfortunately a common mistake. The obvious concern and risk of excessive noise in the workplace is noise-induced hearing loss. But now we have definitive research which links noise exposure with issues and problems such as workplace accidents, anxiety and depression, stress, hypertension and heart disease, high blood pressure, and the disruption of activities. So it's not just noise-induced hearing loss that we need to concern ourselves with. Some of the oversights we see with assessments, very often the purpose and or scope of a report is not clear. It's not obvious whether the report set out to be a survey or whether or not it was intended to be a full assessment. Occasionally the assessor is not identified, and this is particularly alarming. Very often we'll see lots of measurements with little or no interpretation. And then occasionally we see completely inappropriate data being included. For example, we see L-max data and percentiles such as L90, and these have really no relevance in an occupational noise assessment report. Occasionally the weighting networks won't be specified. So is the report presenting results in terms of A-weighted or C-weighted decibels, dBA or dBc? Sometimes this is unstated or unclear in the report. And then regularly we see reports where the personal exposures are not calculated or reported. Very often the legal requirements are not addressed or referenced in an assessment report, and this would be a major oversight. Sometimes the records and details are inadequate, and then very often calibration and instrumentation details are unclear. So a good report, for example, would include details as, to the extent that the serial numbers of the instruments are provided, along with the current calibration certificates. In some reports and in some assessments, the measurement positions are very unclear, or sometimes they might just be unsuitable. Sometimes we have questionable sample duration, and sometimes, one or more of these oversights or these weaknesses might result in an inability to rely on the data. Sometimes the deficiencies are so severe that they effectively invalidate the report. One of the other very important things that we should include in our risk assessment is assessments of hearing protection. So the report should identify where protectors are necessary, what type of protectors are suitable, and then we should calculate their performance ideally using octave band data. In any assessment, we need to apply real-world factors which effectively result in a 4 decibel penalty. So if, based on the manufacturer's data for a set of earmuffs, the attenuation provided by a set of earmuffs, for example, is 28 dB, we should assume in the real world we will get no greater than 24 dB protection. So again, emphasizing the importance of a thorough noise assessment. In some cases, they're going to provide prima facie evidence, and very often the competence of the assessor will be critical to the assessment. They provide a blueprint for action or a justification for inaction. So sometimes the exposure levels will be so low that the employer is obligated to take very little in the way of controls or measures to protect his or her employees from NIHL. In other areas, the risk might be substantial and there may be a range of controls which the employer needs to take. So again, we can consider the noise assessment, the thorough noise assessment, as part of a hearing conservation program. In fact, it's a key element of that program, and if we get it wrong and if it's inaccurate, it has a potential impact on the success of the entire program. So whenever we measure noise and undertake an assessment, there will be some uncertainty. So we need to consider the uncertainties and factor those in when we make our conclusions. Some of these will relate to the type of instrumentation and its precision, and some may relate to the type of working environment. So for example, if we were measuring noise in a walk-in freezer, the equipment will need to be more exacting. Also, if we have air currents or breezes, air movement across a microphone can generate its own noise. So we should also, allow for this and always include a windshield on our microphone. So the hearing conservation program incorporates a number of key elements. The noise risk assessment obviously is a good starting point. Subsequently, we should be in a position to eliminate risks and establish controls where they are appropriate or warranted. And very often this will involve providing a hearing protection program. It's absolutely critical that we provide appropriate information and training for workers. And in fact, these are prescribed requirements in law under the General Application Regulations. Health surveillance and audiometric testing needs to be provided for workers whose hearing is at risk. And we also are compelled to review controls and the risk assessment periodically. So part of the training we provide at Acoustic and Environmental Consultants involves courses in managing risk, in undertaking surveys, and in occupational hygiene as well. So some of our courses are approved by the IOA, that's the Institute of Acoustics, and some are approved and managed by the IOHA. So looking at the occupational hygiene training, again we run international courses. These are 5-day TOEFL programs and they typically involve practical and hands-on training. Normally the groups are relatively small and our tutors are particularly experienced. The examinations and the awards for these courses are issued by the BOHS, that's the British Occupational Hygiene Society. And again, I've listed some of the courses that we currently offer. W501 is the measurement of hazardous substances. W503 is noise, measurement and effects. W507, the health effects of hazardous substances. And W201 is the fundamentals of occupational hygiene. Again, we intend to increase and develop the number of courses that are currently being provided. Some specific noise assessment courses then include, as previously mentioned, the W503, and then we also run the Institute of Acoustic Certificate of Competence in Environmental Noise Measurement and the IOA Certificate in Workplace Noise Risk Assessment. One of the other options we provide is bespoke training, where we can arrange courses at dedicated training centres. In some cases we can even facilitate these at our clients' own sites or premises. So again, some of the contact details for acoustic environmental consultants: telephone 00 353 21 4374 333, email info@env.ie, and our website is accessible through env.ie as well. Thank you for listening.